Well, we've got a whole mess of people here. The outpouring actually is pretty humbling for us. This event, we thought about it about a month and a half ago. A couple of us in the office. It was Julia Zander, our development director's idea, and we applied for a grant for the shelter, and kind of thought it would be maybe half a dozen of us working together. And the outpouring from this community for this has been incredible. As you can see, we've got, let's see, we've got a group from the Stennis here, we've got a group from Triton, we've got Marine Corps Battalion, we've got VFW here, members from the Filipino community and the neighborhood, and a whole bunch of others. I saw see Mayor Patty Lent is here, Councilman Wheeler's wife Sunny is here, Lessa Daugs, of course, City Council. This is her district we're in the middle of. I saw Adam Brockus somewhere here, Councilman Brockus, way back in the back. But most important of all is all the volunteers that are here. So this event is kind of out of the norm, out of the ordinary for Habitat for Humanity. Habitat for Humanity International likes to have the affiliates, we're affiliate of that, do these National Day of Service on 9/11. And normally it's a house building event. But this year we wanted to do something different. Our affiliate in Habitat for Humanity is a self-help housing program. We have volunteers work with low-income families to help build houses. And the city of Bremerton and the military community have been just incredible supports to Habitat over the years, that we wanted to find some way to recognize that. You can't go on a Habitat volunteer build day without finding military people there, Marines, Coast Guard, Army, Air Force, and AmeriCorps volunteers, Corporation and National Service, this 9/11 Day of Service really obviously came out of remembrance of 9/11/2001, and something happened in our nation on that day besides the tragedy. Since that day, right after that, and since then, our nation has really come together in incredible ways around service. Heavenly Father, Father God, Creator, we thank you so much for this event and the people coming together, the overwhelming outpouring of service that we have found from so many for this day. I'd like to have Captain Henry, if you could come forward, and it's a pretty significant event in our family, and Captain Henry's, obviously his family that you'll hear about, and definitely an outpouring of service came from the Filipino community in the U.S. as a result of that. So,
thank you, Daryl. Can everybody hear me? I can't hear myself, but that works well. Distinguished dignitaries, many of whom are wearing those blue t-shirts, and all the rest of the honored volunteers from the Habitat for Humanity, I especially want to thank you for your commitment to the community today. Daryl mentioned my family. My grandfather was on Bataan, and I got a lot of my information from him before he passed on about 35 years ago. I've been asked to explain the significance of the Battle of Bataan and the relevance of this park. So first, it would help to put things in historical perspective. How many history majors do we have here? Just a couple. How many people are really World War II history buffs? A couple more. Well, then hopefully I'm going to educate some of you here. The Battle of Bataan occurred between the 7th of January 1942 and the 9th of April 1942. Keep those dates in mind. Japan had been at war in Manchuria since 1931 and in China since 1933. Hence, they had a very experienced military. It was a militaristic society, and they were pretty good at what they did. The US at the time was an isolationist country. We had disarmed almost completely following World War I. We didn't want to get involved in any more foreign entanglements, and we had two huge oceans to protect us from the rest of the world. That was the state of mind. As war clouds formed over Europe, the US began to rearm. But it was pretty much a case of being a day late and a dollar short. And at the time of Pearl Harbor, we were not in very good shape. Incidentally, the Japanese attacked the Philippines the same day. December 7th in Pearl Harbor, December 8th in the Philippines. All of you guys that have been at sea know what I'm talking about there, the international dateline. The Philippines had no formal military tradition. They had a very good police force called the Philippine Constabulary, but it was not a military. The Philippine Army was established in 1937, the purpose of which was to be a self-defense force following independence, which at that time was planned for about 1945. One regiment in each of the several divisions had been formed, was reasonably well trained and equipped. The second regiment in each of those divisions had been called up about 4 months prior to that. They were not even hardly trained at all, and many of them didn't even have weapons yet. The third regiment was called up about a week before hostilities started. These people not even had uniforms. They were wearing the equivalent of flip-flops, t-shirts, and shorts. No weapons. Give you a state of the Philippine Army at the time. Now, the Allies, which I'll call the Filipinos and the Americans, the Allies, had about 110,000 people mustered in the military. Over half of them were not trained, as I just explained. There was what was called the Philippine Division. The Philippine Division was a U.S. Army division, consisted of 2 infantry regiments, a cavalry regiment, and a couple of field artillery battalions and tank battalions. Tanks were those little tiny things that 2 guys got into. You can see them sticking out the top, had a little pop shooter on the top. Nothing like what we consider to be tanks today. One of the 2 infantry regiments was Philippine Scouts. The cavalry regiment were Philippine Scouts. And when I say cavalry, I'm not talking about what we relate to today as cavalry. I'm talking about horses and mules. What are Philippine Scouts? These guys weren't Boy Scouts. They were Filipinos, properly trained and equipped, and in the United States Army. They were professional soldiers. Okay? In addition to all that, there was the U.S. Asiatic Fleet, consisted of 1 cruiser and a couple of destroyers, some submarines, and motor torpedo boats. The Asiatic Fleet withdrew almost immediately to south of the Philippines to partake in the defense of the Dutch East Indies and Australia. That's how bad things were at that point. They left behind a couple submarines and the motor torpedo boats. They didn't really accomplish much of anything other than the MTBs evacuated MacArthur and a small portion of his staff off of Corregidor on the 12th of March. The Far East Air Force, United States, had about 350 combat aircraft that was essentially wiped out in the first few days of the war by the Japanese Air Force due to a lot of really bad decisions by the American generals, including MacArthur. So hence, the Japanese enjoyed complete aerial superiority for the rest of the campaign after just the first few days. Now, the plan was to get all of our defensive forces onto the Bataan Peninsula after having opposed the Japanese on their landings. Well, we didn't really oppose the landings very well because we didn't have any transportation to get to where they were landing, for starters, with the exception of the 26th Cavalry, Philippine Scouts. And they really did well. They stopped a very large Japanese force from advancing. But then they had to withdraw, or else they'd have been cut off because the rest of the Allied forces were having to withdraw. Getting on to Bataan was a story into itself for another day. But the battle for Bataan started, as I mentioned, on the 9th of January. Because the forces collapsed so quickly into Japan, the defenses on Japan were not properly prepared, and the supplies that were supposed to be staged there mostly didn't make it. Immediately became evident that there were rations for 40,000 people for 6 months. There were 109,000 people to feed. 17,000 Americans, about 68,000 Philippine military, and over 25,000 civilians and refugees. The day after the campaign started, MacArthur declared half rations for everybody. Now, what are half rations? For combat infantrymen, normal rations are considered to be between 3,500 and 4,000 calories a day. That's considered adequate. So in January, they were on 2,000 calories a day. In February, that was cut back to 1,500 calories a day. In March, it was cut back to 1,000 calories a day. Any of you tried to get through 3 or 4 days eating only 1,000 calories each day? It's really tough. It is really tough. These people were starving. They didn't have hardly any meat, hardly any vegetables or fruit. It was mostly starches, rice, and wheat flour. That was pretty much it, at least after the horses and the mules had been eaten. And whatever wildlife that existed on Bataan had been eaten, and therefore there wasn't any wildlife left on Bataan after the first few weeks. The initial main battle position collapsed almost immediately, and that was because it had been improperly prepared. The defenses had been improperly prepared and improperly manned because of the hurry, the rush in getting onto Bataan. They fell back about 5, 7, 8 miles to a rear battle position, which they held for the rest of the campaign. During the rest of the campaign, the Japanese tried to penetrate the forces and were thrown back many, many, many times. They succeeded in penetrating on the western side of the peninsula in the First Corps, and what became known as the Battle of the Pockets ensued, in which 3 Japanese battalions were annihilated. The fighting was done almost exclusively at the Battle of the Pockets by Philippine Army soldiers, with some American officer helping to lead them. But many of the officers were Filipinos. Don't get me wrong, this was not really an American thing. It was mostly a Filipino thing. In addition to that, there was the battles of the points, in which the Japanese tried to do an end run around the Allied positions and landed on a couple of promontories on the southwest coast of Bataan. Again, they were annihilated. More battalions. The result of all this, by the 1st of March, the Japanese had less than 1,500 combat-ready troops. 1,500, that's all. General Homa, the Japanese commander, had to petition to Japan for reinforcements. He was given 2 additional infantry divisions, a great deal of field artillery, including some really heavy stuff, 155 millimeter guns and all, and another 600 combat aircraft. Handwriting was on the wall. There wasn't any medicine for the people that were defending Bataan. They had a little bit of quinine for malaria, but it was in such short supply, it was only given to those people who already had malaria. It's supposed to be used as a prophylactic, not as a treatment, but they didn't have enough. Almost everybody at one time or another came down with malaria, dysentery, beriberi, dengue fever, and all of them suffered from starvation. All of them. You see the pictures of the prisoners on the day they were captured, and they look so emaciated. It's because they starved. They had the will to fight, but they didn't have the physical strength to do so. And the Japanese launched a major attack on the 7th and 8th of April, 1942. The 2-corps line collapsed, and on the 9th of April, the entire Bataan Defense Force was surrendered. What happened next? The Bataan Death March. The units were formed up, not by units, but in groups of 100 men apiece, and started their march from Mariveles at the southern tip of Bataan, 75 miles to San Fernando, which was a railhead. I'm not going to go into all the horrors of the Death March. If you're not familiar with them, you can look them up on the internet. It is eye-opening. But it happened. I'll give you a couple figures. 74,000 men started the Death March. 56,000 made it to Camp O'Donnell. Difference there is 18,000. 9,000 were believed to have died en route over 4 or 5 days. No food, no water, no sanitation, already starving. Another 9,000 are believed to have escaped, mostly Filipinos who could blend in a little better than the Americans could. My grandfather said that at Camp O'Donnell for the first 2 weeks, between 500 and 1,000 more prisoners died from starvation, disease, neglect, inadequate sanitation, everything. Eventually, the Filipinos, for the most part, were released, and the Americans were sent to other prisoner of war camps. And that's pretty much the story of what happened in the spring of 1942. There are many, many monuments to that battle, mostly in the Philippines, many on Bataan. The plaque on one of the historical markers on Bataan reads, quote, "Sealed in blood, the permanent ties of friendship and cooperation between the Philippines and the United States. Dedicated to the memory of the gallant Filipino and American soldiers, as well as civilians, who fought and died side by side in the defense of democracy." Very similar words to what's on this plaque right here behind me. Very similar. This memorial park exemplifies those ideals and is intended to serve to remind all of us of the sacrifices often necessary to preserve our freedoms.
you.